The sound was like a tree branch snapping in half, except it came from inside my leg. I was lying on the kitchen floor, staring at the ceiling tiles I'd helped my stepdad install 3 summers ago, and all I could think was how quiet the house had gotten after Marcus slammed the refrigerator door and walked away. No apology. No checking if I was okay. Just the hum of the air conditioning and my own breathing, shallow and quick because every time I tried to move my right foot, lightning shot up my spine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known better than to ask about the groceries. I should have known that questioning why we spent $300 on steaks when the electricity bill was overdue would set him off. But I was 22, working 2 jobs to help keep our family afloat, and I thought I had the right to know where my money was going. I thought wrong. The whole thing started because I'd noticed the credit card statement lying open on the counter. Marcus never hid his spending, probably because he knew my mother would never question him, and he'd trained me to stay silent about pretty much everything. But this time was different. This time, I saw my own debit card number on some of the charges I definitely hadn't made. Charges for expensive dinners, electronics, even a weekend hotel stay that happened while I was pulling double shifts at the diner. When I asked him about it, calmly, respectfully, the way my mother had taught me to approach Marcus whenever I had concerns, he'd turned from the sink where he was washing dishes and told me I was being paranoid. When I showed him the statement, pointing to my card number, his face changed. Not embarrassed, not apologetic. Angry. "You calling me a thief, Riley?" he'd said, stepping closer. "In my own house?" I'd backed up instinctively, something I'd learned to do over the past 5 years since he'd married my mother. Marcus was a big man, 6'3", with hands like baseball mitts. And when he got angry, the air in the room seemed to shrink. But this time, I didn't back down completely. "It's not about calling you anything," I'd said, holding the statement between us like a shield. "I just need to understand why my card is being used for things I didn't buy. I need that money for school." That's when he'd moved, not just stepped forward, but lunged, grabbing for the paper in my hands. I'd pulled back, turned to put the kitchen island between us, and that's when his hand shot out and shoved me. Hard. Not a little push, not a warning, a full force shove that sent me stumbling backward, my feet tangling with each other, my body hitting the floor with enough impact to knock the wind out of my lungs. But it was my ankle that took the worst of it. My right foot had twisted underneath me as I fell, and when Marcus's boot came down as he moved toward me again, something gave way. The snap, the pain, the sudden understanding that this wasn't just another argument that would blow over by dinner. I lay there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting for him to help me up, to apologize, to at least check if I was seriously hurt. Instead, he picked up the credit card statement from where it had fallen, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the trash. "Maybe next time you'll mind your own business," he'd said. And then I heard his heavy footsteps heading toward the living room, followed by the sound of the television turning on. That's where my mother found me 20 minutes later. Still on the floor, my ankle already swelling to twice its normal size. I expected her to be horrified, to demand an explanation, to at least help me get to the emergency room. Instead, she knelt beside me with the same expression she wore when she found a broken dish or a stain on the carpet. Tired, resigned, like this was just another problem to manage. "What happened, honey?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew and wasn't sure she wanted the details. "Marcus pushed me," I said, the words coming out smaller than I'd intended. "I think my ankle's broken." She glanced toward the living room where we could both hear the sports commentators discussing some baseball game, then back at me. Her hands fluttered around my ankle without actually touching it, like she was afraid to confirm how bad it really was. "Let's get you up and see how it feels," she said. "Maybe it's just a sprain." But when I tried to put weight on it, the pain was so intense I nearly vomited. My mother caught me as I swayed, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small. For a moment, I thought she'd insist on taking me to the hospital right then. Instead, she helped me to the couch and brought me ice wrapped in a dish towel. "We'll see how it looks in the morning," she said. "Sometimes these things seem worse than they are." I stared at her, waiting for her to ask what really happened, to demand the truth from Marcus, to show even a hint of the protective anger I'd seen her display when strangers were rude to me or when teachers had been unfair. But she just adjusted the ice pack and told me to elevate my foot. "Where's Marcus?" I asked. "He's taking a drive," she said quickly. "You know how he gets when he's stressed about work." Stressed about work. As if stealing money from his stepdaughter's bank account was just a side effect of professional pressure. As if breaking bones was a normal response to being caught. That night, I lay awake listening to my mother and Marcus talking in low voices in their bedroom. I couldn't make out most of the words, but I caught fragments. "She's always been dramatic, probably just twisted it. You know how she exaggerates things." By morning, my ankle looked like a purple balloon and I couldn't walk without help. My mother took one look at it and finally admitted we needed to go to the hospital. But not before she sat me down for what she called a little chat. "I know you're in pain, sweetheart," she said, perching on the edge of my bed like a bird ready to fly away. "But I need you to think carefully about how you explain what happened." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" "Well, you know how these things can get blown out of proportion. Doctors, they have to report certain things, and it could cause problems for Marcus at work, for our family." "Problems? He could lose his job, Riley. We could lose the house. And for what? An accident. You fell. These things happen." The word accident hung between us, like a lie we were supposed to agree on. I looked at my mother's face, searching for some sign that she knew how wrong this was, how much she was asking me to sacrifice. But all I saw was the same exhausted desperation that had been there since she'd married Marcus.
The same need to keep peace at any cost. "He pushed me, Mom," I said quietly. "This wasn't an accident." Her face tightened, and for a moment I thought she might finally acknowledge what we both knew. Instead, she stood up and smoothed down her skirt. "Families go through rough patches," she said. "Marriage is about compromise. Sometimes that means not making waves when it's easier to just move forward." Not making waves. That phrase would echo in my head for the next 6 hours as she drove me to the emergency room, as we sat in the waiting room with me gritting my teeth against the pain, as she filled out the paperwork and wrote "fell at home" in the section asking how the injury occurred. I'd heard those words before, always in reference to Marcus, when he'd lost his temper and put his fist through the bathroom door. My mother had said we shouldn't make waves by calling a handyman. She just hung a picture over the hole. When he'd gotten drunk at my high school graduation and made a scene, embarrassing me in front of my friends and teachers, she'd said it wasn't worth making waves by addressing it. Everyone would forget by the next week. When he'd started opening my mail and reading my college acceptance letters before I got home from work, she'd said it wasn't worth making waves because he was just concerned about my future. Always, the solution was for me to absorb the impact, to smooth things over, to pretend that Marcus's behavior was normal family stress, rather than something darker. And I'd gone along with it because I loved my mother, because I wanted to protect the fragile stability she'd built after my father left, because I thought being a good daughter meant swallowing my own needs to keep everyone else comfortable. But sitting in that emergency room, watching my mother lie to the intake nurse about how I'd been injured, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the pain. Or maybe it was the clarity that comes when you realize the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones putting you in danger. Either way, I knew this was different from all the other times I'd stayed quiet. The orthopedic surgeon who eventually saw me was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Hendricks. She had short gray hair, no-nonsense glasses, and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel like she could see right through whatever story you were trying to tell. When she examined my ankle, her touch was gentle but thorough. And when she looked at the x-rays, her expression grew increasingly serious. "This is a pretty significant fracture," she said, pointing to the images on the lightboard. The talus bone here is broken in 2 places, and there's damage to the surrounding ligaments. This isn't the kind of injury you get from just tripping or falling normally. My mother shifted in her chair. She's always been clumsy, she said with a nervous laugh, ever since she was little. Dr. Hendricks looked at her for a moment, then turned back to me. Riley, can you tell me exactly how this happened? I glanced at my mother, who was giving me a look that I'd learned to recognize over the years. It was the same look she'd given me when I was 10 and had wanted to tell my teacher about the bruises on my arms from where Marcus had grabbed me too hard. The same look she'd given me when I was 16 and had wanted to call the police after he'd thrown a plate at the wall during dinner, missing my head by inches. I fell, I said, the words tasting like chalk in my mouth. Dr. Hendricks was quiet for a moment, still studying the x-rays. The pattern of the break suggests significant force, more like what we see in car accidents or sports injuries. Are you sure there wasn't something else involved? Maybe someone else was there when it happened? She told you what happened, my mother said quickly. She fell in the kitchen. Sometimes people just fall badly. But Dr. Hendricks wasn't looking at my mother anymore. She was looking directly at me. And something in her expression told me she'd seen this before. She'd seen young women with broken bones and mothers who couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes when they explained how those bones had gotten broken. Riley, I need to talk to you privately for a few minutes while we discuss your treatment options. Mrs. Carson, would you mind waiting outside? My mother started to protest, but Dr. Hendricks was already walking toward the door, holding it in a way that made it clear this wasn't a request. After a moment of awkward hesitation, my mother gathered her purse and left, but not before giving me another one of those looks. The silence in the room after she left felt different. Heavier, but also safer somehow. Dr. Hendricks closed the door and came back to sit across from me, not behind her desk like a doctor addressing a patient, but in the chair next to mine, like a friend about to share something important. How long has he been hurting you? The question was so direct, so free of the careful dancing around the truth that I'd gotten used to, that for a moment I couldn't speak. All the years of covering for Marcus, of explaining away his outbursts, of pretending that walking on eggshells was normal family life, came rushing back at once. I don't know what you mean, I said. But even as the words came out, I knew they sounded hollow. Riley, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what domestic violence injuries look like. This break, the way it happened, the story that doesn't quite add up, the way your mother is acting, I've seen it all before. And I'm gonna guess this isn't the first time he's hurt you. She was right, of course. The ankle was just the latest in a long line of incidents that my mother had trained me to think of as normal family drama. There was the time Marcus had twisted my wrist when I'd tried to stop him from going through my backpack. The time he'd shoved me into the wall because I accidentally walked in front of the television during one of his shows. The time he'd grabbed my shoulders so hard that he'd left fingerprint bruises that I had to cover with makeup for a week. None of it had seemed serious enough to make a big deal about. Not compared to what I'd seen on television or read about in the news. Marcus had never punched me in the face or sent me to the hospital before this. He'd never broken anything that couldn't heal on its own. According to my mother, that meant we were lucky. According to my mother, that meant it wasn't really abuse. But sitting there in that sterile hospital room, looking at the x-rays of my shattered ankle, I realized how twisted that logic was. I realized that my mother had been moving the goalposts for so long that I'd lost track of where the boundary should have been in the first place. He's my stepfather, I said, finally, as if that explained everything. And, Dr. Hendricks prompted, and my mother says it's complicated. Family stuff. She says I shouldn't make waves. Dr. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. And when she spoke again, her voice was careful but firm. Riley, I want you to listen to me very carefully. What happened to you was not an accident. What happened to you was not your fault. And what happened to you was not okay, no matter what anyone else in your family tells you. Hearing someone say those words out loud, someone with authority and medical training and no emotional investment in keeping our family secrets, was like having a light turned on in a room I'd been stumbling around in for years. For the first time since Marcus had pushed me, I felt like maybe I wasn't crazy for thinking this was wrong. But what am I supposed to do? I asked. If I tell the truth, if I report him, my mother will never forgive me. She'll lose everything. The house, her marriage, her stability. She's 48 years old and she's never lived on her own. I can't destroy her life because I can't handle a little family drama. First of all, Dr. Hendricks said, this isn't a little family drama. This is assault. Second, protecting someone else's choices isn't your responsibility, especially when those choices are putting you in danger. And third, you're not destroying anything. He did that when he decided to put his hands on you. She stood up and walked over to her desk, pulling out a business card and writing something on the back of it. I'm going to give you some information, she said. Not because I'm going to force you to do anything, but because I want you to know what your options are. There's a social worker here at the hospital who specializes in domestic violence cases. There are shelters, legal advocates, support groups. There are people who can help you figure out how to be safe, even if that means making some difficult decisions about your family. She handed me the card, and I stared at it like it was written in a foreign language. Part of me wanted to tear it up right there, to prove to myself and to her that I wasn't the kind of person who needed those services. I wasn't some helpless victim. I was just a normal young woman from a normal family dealing with normal stress. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since I'd heard that snap in my ankle, wanted to hold onto that card like a lifeline. I'm also legally required to file a report about this injury, Dr. Hendricks continued. Not because I want to make trouble for your family, but because that's how we protect people. The report will go to Adult Protective Services, and someone will follow up with you to make sure you're safe. You don't have to cooperate with that investigation if you don't want to, but at least someone outside your family will know what happened. My stomach dropped. My mother's gonna kill me. Your mother is going to be upset, Dr. Hendricks corrected, but that's her choice about how to react. Your choice is whether you want to keep protecting the person who hurt you or start protecting yourself. She sat back down and looked at me with the kind of steady compassion I'd never gotten from my own family. Riley, I know this feels overwhelming. I know it feels like you're being asked to choose between your safety and your family's happiness. But that's a false choice. A real family would never ask you to sacrifice your safety for their comfort. Over the next hour, while we waited for my ankle to be put in a cast, Dr. Hendricks explained what would happen next. The report she filed would trigger an investigation by Adult Protective Services. A social worker would contact me within 48 hours to discuss the incident and assess my living situation. If I chose to cooperate, they could help me explore options for getting somewhere safe, pressing charges, or obtaining a restraining order. She also explained that my ankle would need surgery to repair the fracture properly, and that I'd be on crutches for at least 2 months, followed by several more months of physical therapy. The injury was serious enough that it could affect my ability to work, to go to school, to take care of myself independently. The good news is that with proper treatment, you should heal completely, she said. But this isn't something you can just walk off or ignore. Your body is going to force you to slow down and recover, which might actually be a blessing in disguise. It'll give you time to think about what you want your life to look like going forward. When my mother came back into the room, her face was tight with anxiety. She'd probably spent the entire time I was alone with Dr. Hendricks imagining worst-case scenarios, and from the way she kept glancing between us, I could tell she sensed that something had shifted. Dr. Hendricks explained the treatment plan in the same professional tone she'd used with me, but I noticed she made sure to mention the report she had filed. My mother's face went pale, and she started to say something, but Dr. Hendricks cut her off. Mrs. Carson, I want to be very clear about something. Your daughter has suffered a serious injury that will require extensive treatment and recovery time. She's going to need support, patience, and above all, she's going to need to feel safe in her home environment. Any additional stress or trauma could significantly impact her healing process. It was a diplomatic way of saying that if Marcus laid a hand on me again, there would be medical consequences to document alongside the legal ones. My mother understood the message, even if she didn't like it. The ride home was silent, except for the sound of my mother's breathing, which had taken on the sharp, shallow rhythm it always got when she was trying not to cry. I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods we passed, wondering if I'd ever see them the same way again. Everything looked different when you realized that the people who were supposed to love you most were the ones you needed protection from. When we pulled into our driveway, I could see Marcus through the living room window, sitting in his recliner with a beer in his hand, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't broken his stepdaughter's ankle 12 hours earlier, like he wasn't about to have his life turned upside down by the report that was already making its way through the system. My mother turned off the car, but didn't make any move to get out. For a moment, we just sat there in the garage, listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. "Riley?" she said finally, and her voice was smaller than I've ever heard it. "What did you tell that doctor?" I told the truth. She closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the steering wheel. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Yeah," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "I stopped pretending that getting hurt is normal." The next 2 days passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I stayed in my room mostly, coming out only for meals and to ice my ankle, trying to process everything that had happened while also bracing myself for whatever was coming next. My mother moved around the house like a ghost, cleaning things that were already clean, organizing drawers that didn't need organizing, doing anything that would keep her busy enough to avoid talking about the elephant in the room. Marcus, on the other hand, acted like nothing had changed. He went to work, came home, ate dinner, watched television, went to bed. If he was worried about the report Dr. Hendricks had filed, he didn't show it. If he felt any guilt about what he had done to me, it didn't affect his appetite or his sleep. He even had the audacity to ask me to make him a sandwich on the second day, as if I could walk normally, as if he hadn't been the reason I was on crutches in the first place. When I told him I couldn't get around the kitchen easily with my ankle, he had shrugged and said, "Your mom can do it then. She's not the one who fell." Fell. Even after everything, he was still pretending it had been an accident, still rewriting history to make himself the innocent bystander rather than the cause. But his denial couldn't change what was already in motion. On Thursday morning, exactly 48 hours after Dr. Hendricks had filed her report, there was a knock at our door. I was sitting on the couch with my leg elevated, working on an assignment for one of my summer classes, when I heard my mother answer. "Mrs. Carson? My name is Janet Williams. I'm a social worker with Adult Protective Services. I'm here to follow up on a report we received regarding your daughter Riley." I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, followed by a long pause. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," she said finally. "My daughter had an accident, but everything's fine now." "I'd like to speak with Riley directly, if that's possible," the social worker said. "It's standard procedure in cases like this." Cases like this. I realized that what had happened to me wasn't unique, wasn't some isolated family drama that we could just sweep under the rug and move on from. It was a pattern, something that happened often enough that there were procedures for handling it, people whose job it was to intervene. My mother led Janet Williams into the living room, and I got my first look at the person who was about to change everything. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me a little of Dr. Hendricks. She carried a folder and wore the kind of comfortable shoes that suggested she spent a lot of time walking into situations where she wasn't particularly welcome. "Hi, Riley," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "How are you feeling?" It was such a simple question, but nobody had asked me that since the accident. My mother had asked if I needed anything, if I was comfortable, if the pain medication was working, but nobody had asked how I was feeling about what had happened, about the fact that my own stepfather had broken my ankle and then pretended it was my fault. "Confused," I said honestly, and angry, and scared. My mother shot me a warning look, but Janet was nodding like those were exactly the emotions she'd expect someone in my situation to be experiencing. That all makes sense, she said. Can you tell me what happened 2 days ago? I glanced at my mother, who was perched on the edge of the couch like she was ready to jump up and intervene if I said the wrong thing. For a moment, I wavered. It would be so easy to stick to the story we'd agreed on, to tell Janet that I'd fallen, to send her away so we could all go back to pretending we were a normal family. But then I thought about Dr. Hendricks and the way she'd looked at me when she'd said that what happened wasn't my fault. I thought about the card she'd given me, still tucked in my wallet, with the phone numbers for services I'd never imagined I'd need. I thought about the x-rays showing my broken bone and the months of recovery ahead of me, all because I dared to ask about my own money being stolen. My stepfather pushed me. I confronted him about using my debit card without permission, and he got angry and shoved me. I fell and broke my ankle. The silence in the room was deafening. My mother's face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds, settling finally on a kind of resigned devastation. Janet, meanwhile, was writing notes in her folder, her expression calm and professional. "Was anyone else present when this happened?" she asked. "No, my mother came home afterward and found me on the floor." "And where is your stepfather now?" "At work," my mother said quickly. "He works construction. He's been very upset about Riley's accident." Janet looked at her with the same kind of measured patience I'd seen Dr. Hendricks use. "Mrs. Carson, I understand this is a difficult situation for your family, but I want to be clear that what Riley has described isn't an accident. It's assault. And my job is to make sure she's safe while we figure out how to address what happened." "He's not a monster," my mother said, and for the first time since I'd told the truth, her voice cracked. He has a temper sometimes, but he's never seriously hurt anyone before. This was just a bad day." "Has he put his hands on Riley before this incident?" Janet asked. My mother looked at me pleadingly, and I realized she was still hoping I'd lie, still hoping I'd protect the illusion of our happy family, even now. "Yes," I said. "Not like this, but yes, he's grabbed me, pushed me, shoved me into walls, usually when he's angry about something else and I happen to be nearby." "How long has this been going on?" "Since he married my mother 5 years ago. Maybe not right away, but pretty soon after." Janet made more notes, then looked up at both of us. "Riley, I need to ask you this directly. Do you feel safe living in this house with your stepfather?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I knew what my mother wanted me to say. I knew what would keep our family together, what would avoid the drama and upheaval that telling the truth would bring. But I also knew what Dr. Hendricks had told me about false choices, about families that asked you to sacrifice your safety for their comfort. "No," I said, and saying it out loud felt like stepping off a cliff. "I don't feel safe here." What followed was the most difficult conversation I'd ever been part of. Janet explained that there were several options for ensuring my safety while the investigation proceeded. I could stay with relatives or friends, apply for emergency shelter placement, or remain in the home if Marcus agreed to leave temporarily. Given that he was the primary breadwinner and his name was on the lease, the last option seemed unlikely. My mother kept trying to minimize what had happened, to convince Janet that this was all a misunderstanding that could be worked out with family counseling or anger management classes. But Janet had heard these arguments before, and she wasn't buying it. "Mrs. Carson, I understand that you love your husband and want to protect your family, but your daughter has been physically abused by someone who has significantly more power than she does, both physically and financially. The fact that it escalated to a broken bone suggests that the pattern is getting worse, not better. Even if Marcus agreed to counseling, Riley would still be living with someone who has already proven he's willing to hurt her when he's angry." "But where is she supposed to go?" my mother asked. "She's in college. She works 2 jobs just to pay for her classes and books."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She can't afford her own place. It was true. Despite working constantly, I was barely scraping by financially. Most of my income went toward tuition and textbooks, and the little bit left over went toward helping with household expenses. I'd been planning to live at home through graduation to save money, but that plan obviously wasn't going to work anymore. Janet explained that there were resources available to help people in my situation: emergency housing assistance, temporary financial support, connections to legal aid services. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be comfortable, but it was possible. The important thing right now is getting you somewhere safe while we sort out the details, she said. Do you have any family or friends you could stay with temporarily? I thought about my options. My father lived across the country and had remarried. We barely spoke twice a year, and I couldn't imagine calling him up to explain that my mother's husband had broken my ankle. My grandmother on my mother's side had passed away 2 years earlier. Most of my friends were college students like me, living in tiny apartments or dorm rooms, struggling to make ends meet. But then I remembered my Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister who lived about an hour away. Linda had never liked Marcus, though she'd been diplomatic enough not to say so directly. She'd made comments over the years about how different my mother seemed since the marriage, how quiet I'd become at family gatherings. I'd always thought she was just being dramatic, but maybe she'd been seeing things more clearly than the rest of us. I might be able to stay with my aunt, I said, at least for a little while. My mother's face crumpled. Riley, please, can't we try to work this out? Maybe Marcus could go to counseling. Maybe we could set some ground rules. You're my daughter. I don't want to lose you over this. The words "over this" hung between us like an accusation. As if I was the one creating drama. As if I was the one breaking up the family by refusing to accept being hurt as normal. Mom, I said, and I could hear the exhaustion in my own voice. You're not losing me over this. You're losing me because you're choosing him over me. You've been choosing him over me for 5 years. It was harsh, but it was also true. Every time she'd asked me not to make waves, every time she'd explained away his behavior, every time she'd acted like I was being too sensitive or dramatic, she'd been making a choice. She'd been choosing his comfort over my safety, his reputation over my well-being, his version of reality over mine. Janet gave us both a moment to process what I'd said, then continued with the practical details. She would help me contact my aunt and arrange a temporary living situation. She would also connect me with a victim's advocate who could explain my legal options and help me navigate the process if I decided to press charges. What about school? I asked. I'm supposed to start my senior year in 6 weeks. We'll figure that out, Janet said. There are ways to transfer aid, to get emergency assistance for students in crisis situations. The important thing is making sure you're safe first. Everything else we can work around. After Janet left, my mother and I sat in the living room without speaking for a long time. I could see her trying to process everything that had just happened, trying to figure out how her life had gone from normal to completely upended in the span of 72 hours. I know you think I'm choosing him over you, she said, finally. But it's not that simple, Riley. I'm almost 50 years old. I don't have a college degree. I've been out of the workforce for 3 years. If Marcus leaves, if we get divorced, I'll lose everything. The house, the insurance, the security. I'll be starting over with nothing. I understood her fear. I really did. But understanding it didn't make her choices okay. Mom, I said, I've been helping you keep this family together for 5 years. I've been walking on eggshells, staying quiet when he hurts me, contributing money I can't afford to contribute, all because I thought that was what being a good daughter meant. But he broke my ankle. He could have broken my leg, or my back, or my neck. What happens next time? There won't be a next time, she said quickly. I'll talk to him. I'll make sure he understands that this can't happen again. You shouldn't have to make sure he understands that he can't assault me, I said. That should be a given. The fact that you think you need to have that conversation with him tells you everything you need to know about what kind of person he is. We were interrupted by the sound of Marcus's truck in the driveway. My mother's whole body tensed, and I realized she was as afraid of his reaction as I was.
Maybe more so, since she was the one who was going to have to explain why a social worker had been to the house, why there was now an official investigation into his behavior. He came through the front door the way he always did, heavy footsteps and the jingle of keys being tossed onto the table. But when he walked into the living room and saw both of us sitting there with obvious tension between us, his expression shifted. "What's going on?" he asked, looking back and forth between us. My mother took a deep breath. "We need to talk." Over the next hour, I watched my stepfather's face go through a range of emotions as my mother explained about the social worker's visit, about the investigation, about my decision to stay with my aunt until things got sorted out. At first, he was angry, demanding to know why I'd made up stories about him to strangers. Then he was defensive, insisting that what had happened was an accident and that I was blowing everything out of proportion. But as my mother continued talking, as the reality of the situation became clear, I saw something else in his expression. Not remorse, exactly, but calculation. He was starting to understand that this wasn't just family drama anymore. This was legal trouble. This was the kind of thing that could affect his job, his reputation, his future. "This is ridiculous," he said finally. "I didn't assault anyone. She fell. It was an accident." "Marcus," my mother said quietly. "The doctor said the injury was consistent with significant force. The social worker has medical records. So what? Doctors don't know everything. Maybe she fell harder than we thought." I listened to him dig himself deeper into the lie, marveling at his ability to deny reality even when faced with official investigation. But I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even scared. I was just tired.
Tired of pretending this was normal. Tired of protecting someone who had never bothered to protect me. "I'm leaving," I said, interrupting his increasingly frantic justifications. "I'm going to stay with Aunt Linda while the investigation happens. After that, I'll figure out something more permanent." Marcus turned to look at me directly for the first time since he'd come home. "You're really going to destroy this family over a little accident?" "I'm not destroying anything," I said, echoing Dr. Hendrix's words. "You did that when you decided to put your hands on me." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to gauge whether I was serious, whether I'd really follow through on cooperating with the investigation. When he realized I wasn't backing down, his expression hardened. "Fine," he said, "but don't expect to come crawling back when you realize how good you had it here." That night, I called my Aunt Linda and explained the situation. She was horrified, not just about what Marcus had done, but about the fact that my mother had been covering for him all these years. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "You used to be such a vibrant kid, and over the past few years, you've just seemed so diminished. I should have said something sooner." "It's not your fault," I told her. "I was pretty good at hiding it. Mom trained me well." Linda came to pick me up the next morning. As I packed my belongings, trying to figure out what I'd need for an indefinite stay away from home, my mother hovered in the doorway of my room looking lost. "This doesn't have to be permanent," she said. "Maybe after some time passes, after things calm down, we can figure out a way to work this out." I stopped packing and looked at her. "Mom, the only way this works out is if Marcus leaves and gets serious help for his anger issues. And I mean serious help, not just a few counseling sessions to appease the social worker. Even then, it would take a long time for me to trust that it was safe to be around him." "He's not going to leave," she said quietly. "This is his home too." "Then you've made your choice," I said. The drive to Linda's house was quiet, but not uncomfortable. My aunt had always been the kind of person who didn't need to fill silence with chatter, and I was grateful for the space to think. As we got further away from the neighborhood where I'd grown up, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't have to worry about saying the wrong thing or moving too loudly or existing in a way that might set someone off. I didn't have to monitor Marcus's moods or try to predict what might make him angry. I didn't have to watch my mother perform the exhausting dance of keeping him happy while pretending everything was normal. I was hurt and scared and uncertain about the future,
but I was also free. Living with Aunt Linda was like stepping into a parallel universe where normal families actually existed. She made coffee every morning without checking anyone's mood first. She asked me how I was feeling and actually waited for an honest answer. When I needed help getting up the stairs with my crutches, she didn't act like it was an inconvenience or something I should be grateful for. She just helped. But more importantly, she treated what had happened to me like it mattered. The first night I was there, she sat me down at her kitchen table and said something that changed everything. "Riley, I want you to know that what Marcus did to you was criminal. Not family drama, not a misunderstanding, not something you brought on yourself. Criminal. And the fact that your mother is acting like you should just get over it tells me she's been covering for him for a lot longer than just this incident." She was right, of course. Over the next few days, as I had time and space to think without constantly monitoring someone else's mood, I started remembering things differently. Incidents I'd dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings began to look like what they really were, a pattern of escalating abuse that my mother had trained me to normalize. The day after I moved in with Linda, Janet Williams called to schedule a follow-up meeting. This time, she came to Linda's house, and the difference in atmosphere was striking. No one was hovering nervously in the background, ready to interrupt if I said the wrong thing. No one was sending me warning looks or trying to control the narrative. "How are you settling in?" Janet asked, settling into Linda's comfortable living room. "Better," I said, and meant it. It's weird not having to worry about accidentally setting someone off. "That's not weird," Janet said. "That's how you should always feel in your living situation. The fact that it feels unusual to you tells me a lot about what your home environment has been like." She had updates on the investigation. Adult Protective Services had interviewed Marcus separately, and his story had been inconsistent with both mine and the medical evidence. He'd stuck to the accident narrative, but when pressed for details about exactly how I'd fallen, his explanations kept changing. Meanwhile, the hospital records clearly documented injuries consistent with force, not just a simple fall. "We're also looking into the financial abuse you mentioned," Janet said. "Using someone else's debit card without permission is theft, regardless of family relationships. Do you have documentation of those charges?" "I do, actually. I'd been keeping careful track of my finances since starting college, and I had bank statements going back 2 years that showed unauthorized charges from Marcus's spending. I'd never thought of it as theft before. In my mind, it had just been one more thing I was supposed to tolerate for the sake of family harmony. "I have everything," I told Janet. "Bank statements, receipts, even some emails where I asked my mom about the charges and she said Marcus would pay me back." "That's helpful," she said, making notes. "Financial abuse often goes hand in hand with physical abuse. It's another way of exercising control." Janet also told me that I had the option of pressing criminal charges for the assault. It wouldn't be easy, she warned. It would mean going through the court system, possibly testifying against Marcus in front of a judge, dealing with lawyers and paperwork and months of legal proceedings. But it would also mean that what he'd done to me would be officially recognized as a crime, not just a family drama. "I need to think about it," I said. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Riley, I want you to know that pressing charges isn't just about punishing Marcus. It's about establishing a legal record of his behavior. If he hurts someone else in the future, there will be documentation of a pattern." After Janet left, Linda and I talked for hours about what my options really were. She'd been through her own difficult divorce years earlier and understood how the legal system worked, how important it was to document everything and build a strong case if you wanted to be taken seriously.
"The thing is," she said, "people like Marcus count on their victims staying quiet. They count on shame and family pressure and financial dependence to keep people from fighting back. But you're not dependent on him anymore. You're not trapped in that house with him. You have choices now." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started documenting. I began with a timeline, writing down every incident of abuse I could remember from the past 5 years. Not just the physical stuff, but the financial manipulation, the intimidation, the way he'd isolated me from friends by making me uncomfortable about bringing them to the house. I wrote down dates when I could remember them,
approximate timeframes when I couldn't. I described each incident in detail, noting any witnesses, any resulting injuries, any photos I might have taken. The process was exhausting and painful, but also clarifying. Seeing it all written down, I could trace the escalation clearly. It had started small, grabbing my arm too hard when he was angry about something else, making comments about how I was too sensitive when I objected. But over time, the incidents had become more frequent and more severe. I also realized how much my mother had helped normalize it all. Every time she'd told me not to make waves, every time she'd explained away his behavior as stress or said I was overreacting, she'd been grooming me to accept abuse as normal family dynamics. The next step was gathering evidence. I still had my phone from 5 years ago, and when I went through old photos, I found several that showed bruises on my arms and shoulders. At the time, I'd taken them almost without thinking, maybe planning to show my mom how bad the bruising was. But I'd never followed through, and eventually I'd forgotten about them entirely. I also had text message threads with friends where I'd mentioned Marcus's behavior, usually downplaying it, but still documenting that it had happened. Messages where I'd canceled plans because things are tense at home, or where I'd asked to stay at someone's dorm because my stepdad is in a mood. Then there were the financial records. I printed out bank statements going back 3 years, highlighting every unauthorized charge. The total was staggering, over $4,000 that Marcus had stolen from me over time. Money I'd earned working double shifts at the diner. Money I'd needed for textbooks and car repairs and school supplies. Linda helped me organize everything into a comprehensive file. She'd worked as a paralegal before her marriage, and she understood the importance of presenting information clearly and chronologically. We created a folder with sections for each type of evidence: medical records, financial documentation, photos, witness statements, timeline of incidents. "This is a strong case," she said, reviewing the file. "You have medical evidence, financial evidence, photographic evidence, and contemporary documentation through your text messages. Most domestic violence cases don't have this much supporting material." The hardest part was getting statements from witnesses. I reached out to friends who had seen Marcus's behavior over the years, asking them to write down what they remembered. Some were eager to help, telling me they'd always been concerned but hadn't known what to do. Others were uncomfortable getting involved in what they saw as family business. My friend Sarah from high school wrote a particularly powerful statement about a time Marcus had cornered me at my graduation party, grabbing my wrist hard enough to leave marks when I'd tried to walk away from his criticism of my college choice. She'd wanted to say something at the time, but I'd begged her not to make a scene. "I always wondered why you stopped inviting people over to your house. Now I understand," she wrote. Even my manager at the diner provided a statement about the times I'd shown up to work with visible bruises, always with explanations about being clumsy or having accidents. She'd suspected something was wrong, but hadn't known how to approach it. "Young women don't usually have that many accidents," she noted in her statement. While I was building my case, the investigation continued on the official side. Janet kept me updated on the progress, and what she told me made it clear that Marcus was not handling the scrutiny very well. He'd been required to attend an interview with Adult Protective Services, and according to Janet, he'd been belligerent and defensive. He insisted that I was lying, that I was a troubled young woman who had always been difficult and dramatic. He'd suggested that I was making up stories to get attention or to cause problems for his marriage to my mother. But his explanations didn't hold up under questioning. When asked about the financial irregularities, he claimed I'd given him permission to use my card, but he couldn't provide any evidence of that permission. When pressed about the specific mechanism of my injury, his story kept changing. First I'd tripped, then I'd slipped, then I'd lost my balance reaching for something. Meanwhile, my mother was facing her own reckoning. Janet had interviewed her separately as well, and according to the report, she'd been forced to acknowledge that there had been previous incidents between Marcus and I. She'd tried to minimize them, but when confronted with the evidence I'd provided, she couldn't deny them entirely. The breaking point came when Janet asked her directly whether she'd ever seen Marcus put his hands on me. After a long pause, my mother had admitted that, yes, she'd seen him grab me or push me when he was angry, but that it wasn't serious, that it was just how some families handled conflict. I explained to her that physical violence is never an appropriate way to handle family conflict, and that by normalizing it, she'd been failing in her duty to protect me. The most damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Marcus's employer required background checks for all employees, and when the assault report showed up in the system, his boss called him in for a meeting. Construction sites have zero tolerance for violence, even domestic violence, because it's considered a liability issue. Marcus had tried to explain it away as a misunderstanding, but his boss wasn't buying it. He was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation, which meant he was suddenly facing the very real possibility of losing his job over what he'd done to me. That's when everything started to unravel for him. The first sign was a series of increasingly frantic phone calls to my mother. Linda's house had a landline, and since my mother didn't have Linda's cell number, she kept calling there trying to reach me. Linda would answer, listen to my mother's pleas for me to call Marcus and work things out, and calmly explain that I was under no obligation to contact someone who had assaulted me. She keeps saying this is all a misunderstanding, Linda told me after one such call. She wants you to call the social worker and tell them it was an accident. And tell them what, exactly? That I lied to the doctor? That I made up the financial abuse? That all those photos of bruises were from me being clumsy? The pressure campaign escalated when other family members got involved. My mother had apparently told her version of the story to anyone who would listen, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who was destroying the family over a minor incident. Some of my cousins called to urge me to reconsider, to think about what this was doing to my mother, to remember that family was supposed to forgive and move forward. But Linda had prepared me for this. She'd warned me that abusers often recruit other family members to pressure their victims into dropping charges or backing down. She called it flying monkeys, people who might mean well, but were unknowingly doing the abuser's dirty work by pressuring me to give up my pursuit of justice. The thing you have to remember, she told me, is that these people weren't there when it happened. They didn't see your broken ankle or hear Marcus refuse to apologize. They're reacting to your mother's version of events, which probably makes it sound like you're blowing things out of proportion. She was right. When I talked to my cousin Michelle, who had called to urge me to work things out, it became clear that she thought I'd merely argued with Marcus and then accidentally fallen. She had no idea about the pattern of abuse, the financial theft, or the severity of my injury. I had surgery, Michelle, I told her. My ankle was broken in 2 places. This wasn't some minor scuffle. The conversation changed after that. When Michelle understood the reality of what had happened, she stopped pressuring me to reconcile and started asking what she could do to help. But not everyone was willing to hear the truth. Some family members remained convinced that I was causing unnecessary drama, that families should handle these things privately. A few even suggested that I was partially to blame for provoking Marcus by questioning his spending. Those conversations were the hardest because they showed me how deeply ingrained the belief was that keeping families together mattered more than keeping family members safe.
But they also strengthened my resolve because I could see how easily I could have become someone who accepted abuse as normal if I hadn't had people like Dr. Hendricks and Janet and Linda showing me that there was another way. The investigation reached a turning point when Janet told me that Adult Protective Services was recommending that charges be filed, whether I cooperated or not. The evidence was strong enough that the state could prosecute Marcus for assault even without my active participation, though my cooperation would make the case much stronger. But ultimately, the decision about whether to press charges yourself is still yours, she explained. The state can prosecute the assault, but you also have the option of pursuing civil charges for the financial abuse and emotional distress. I spent a week thinking about it. Linda didn't pressure me either way, but she did share her own experience of going through the legal system during her divorce. The process isn't easy, she said. Courts can be frustrating, lawyers are expensive, and there's always the possibility that things won't go the way you want them to. But there's also something powerful about standing up in front of a judge and saying, "This person hurt me, and I want that to be officially recognized." What finally made up my mind was thinking about the next person Marcus might hurt.
If he could escalate from pushing and grabbing to breaking bones with me, what might he do to the next woman who challenged him? What if my mother finally got fed up with his behavior? What if he started dating someone new after their marriage inevitably fell apart? I couldn't live with the knowledge that I'd had the chance to establish a legal record of his violence and had chosen not to take it. I called Janet and told her I wanted to press charges, both criminal charges for the assault and civil charges for the financial abuse and emotional distress. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Once we start this process, there's no going back. It's going to be stressful and public and difficult." "I'm sure," I said. "He needs to face consequences for what he did, and I need to know that I stood up for myself." The legal process moved quickly once I decided to cooperate fully. The district attorney assigned a prosecutor who specialized in domestic violence cases, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Reeves who had been handling these types of cases for over a decade. When I met with her to give my formal statement, she was impressed with the evidence I'd compiled. "Most victims don't have this level of documentation," she said. "It's going to make our job a lot easier." She explained what would happen next. Marcus would be formally charged with assault in the 3rd degree and theft in the 2nd degree. He'd be arrested, processed, and released on bail unless the judge considered him a flight risk. There would be a preliminary hearing, probably plea negotiations, and potentially a trial if he didn't accept a plea deal. "What are the chances he'll just plead guilty?" I asked. "Hard to say," she admitted. "Some defendants in these cases prefer to take their chances with a jury, especially if they think they can paint the victim as vindictive or unstable. But the evidence in your case is strong enough that a guilty plea might be his best option." She also warned me that Marcus would likely hire a defense attorney who would try to discredit me and my evidence. They might argue that my injuries were accidental, that I'd given Marcus permission to use my bank card, that I was a disgruntled stepdaughter trying to cause trouble. "They'll probably try to make this about family dysfunction rather than criminal behavior," she said. "That's standard in domestic violence cases. But we have medical evidence, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses. They're going to have a hard time explaining all of that away." The day Marcus was arrested, I was in physical therapy for my ankle. Linda had driven me to the appointment, and when we came out, there were 3 missed calls on my phone from my mother. I didn't call back, but Linda suggested we drive by the house on our way home just to see what was happening. There were 2 police cars in the driveway. We didn't stop, but Linda drove slowly enough that I could see Marcus being let out in handcuffs. He looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating. Maybe it was seeing him in a situation where he had no control, where he couldn't intimidate or manipulate his way out of consequences. My mother was standing in the doorway, crying. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. Whatever else she'd done wrong, she was watching her husband being arrested, knowing her marriage was probably over. But then I remembered all the time she'd asked me not to make waves, all the time she'd chosen his comfort over my safety, all the time she'd acted like I was the problem for not accepting abuse as normal. My sympathy didn't last long. That evening, she called Linda's house again. This time, I decided to answer. "Riley, thank God," she said, and her voice was ragged from crying. "You have to help me. You have to call the prosecutor and tell them this is all a mistake." "It's not a mistake, Mom," I said calmly. "Marcus assaulted me. He stole money from me. Those are crimes, regardless of whether we're related." "But they arrested him at his job. Everyone saw. He's humiliated, and now he's going to lose everything. His job, his reputation, his freedom. Over what? A family argument that got out of hand?" "Over the fact that he broke my ankle and stole $4,000 from me," I corrected. "This isn't about a family argument. This is about criminal behavior." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was harder. "I hope you're happy. I hope destroying our family was worth it." "I didn't destroy our family. Marcus did that when he decided to put his hands on me. You did that when you decided to cover for him instead of protecting me." I hung up before she could respond. Over the next few weeks, as the legal process moved forward, I started to understand something that no one had ever taught me. the difference between family loyalty and enabling abuse. Real family loyalty meant protecting vulnerable members from harm, not protecting abusers from consequences. Real family loyalty meant believing victims when they spoke up, not silencing them to keep the peace. My mother had confused enabling with loyalty, and she'd taught me to do the same. But I was learning to tell the difference. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest. Patricia Reeves prepared me for what to expect. It would be brief, just a formal presentation of charges and evidence to establish that there was probable cause for a trial. Marcus would be there with his lawyer, but I probably wouldn't have to testify unless his attorney contested the basic facts of the case. The important thing to remember, she said, is that this is just the beginning. The real work happens if we go to trial, but this hearing will give us a sense of how he's going to defend himself. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep, not because I was nervous about seeing Marcus again, but because I was excited.
For the first time in my adult life, I was going to watch someone face real consequences for hurting me. Not family consequences, not social consequences, but legal consequences that couldn't be explained away or minimized. Linda offered to come with me, and I was grateful for the support. She'd been to enough court proceedings during her divorce to know how to navigate the system, and she'd become something of an expert on victims' rights. "Remember," she told me as we walked into the courthouse, "you're not the one on trial here. You're not the one who has to justify your behavior. Marcus is the one who has to explain why he thought it was okay to break your ankle." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected and much more formal. Marcus was already there with his lawyer, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Marcus himself looked terrible. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a kind of hollow anxiety that made him seem older and smaller. When the judge called the case, Patricia Reeves stood up and presented the charges clearly and methodically. Assault in the 3rd degree, theft in the 2nd degree, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She outlined the evidence briefly: medical records, financial documentation, witness statements, photographic evidence. Marcus's lawyer requested that the assault charge be reduced to a misdemeanor, arguing that this was a family dispute that had gotten out of hand rather than a serious criminal assault. He suggested that the financial charges were based on a misunderstanding, that Marcus had believed he had permission to use my bank card. The judge listened to both sides, then reviewed the evidence briefly. When he spoke, his voice was firm and clear. The medical evidence indicates that Ms. Carson's injuries were consistent with significant force, not an accidental fall. The financial evidence shows a pattern of unauthorized use over an extended period. The court finds probable cause for all charges as filed. That was it. Marcus would stand trial for felony assault and theft. The preliminary hearing lasted less than 30 minutes. But in that time, everything I'd been through was officially validated. A judge had looked at the evidence and agreed that what happened to me was criminal. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Reeves was pleased with the outcome. "The judge could have reduced the charges or found insufficient evidence," she said. "The fact that he didn't means we have a strong case going into trial." Marcus's lawyer approached us as we were leaving, asking if we'd be interested in discussing a plea agreement. Patricia told him to contact her office to set up a meeting, but she warned me that any plea would probably involve some jail time. Most domestic violence charges don't result in significant prison sentences, especially for first-time offenders, she explained. But we can push for probation conditions that would protect you, like a no-contact order and mandatory anger management counseling. As we drove home, Linda asked me how I was feeling. "Relieved," I said, and realized it was true. For the first time since this whole thing started, I feel like someone with authority is taking it seriously. That night, my mother called again, but this time her tone was different, less demanding, more desperate. "Riley, Marcus's lawyer says he might go to prison, real prison, for years. That's what happens when you assault people and steal from them," I said. "But what am I supposed to do? If he goes to prison, I'll lose the house. I'll lose everything. I'll be completely alone." For a moment, I felt the old, familiar tug of responsibility, the ingrained need to fix her problems, to sacrifice my own well-being for her security.
But then I remembered what Dr. Hendricks had said about false choices. "You're not completely alone," I said. "You have family who would help you if you left Marcus. You have options. You've always had options. You just chose him instead." "It's not that simple," she said. "It is that simple," I replied. "You can choose to support the person who hurt your daughter, or you can choose to build a life that doesn't depend on staying married to someone who breaks people's bones when he's angry. But you can't have both." The conversation ended there, and I realized it might be the last time we spoke for a long time. I wasn't cutting her off permanently, but I also wasn't going to keep pretending that her choices didn't have consequences. 2 weeks later, Patricia Reeves called with news Marcus's lawyer wanted to discuss a plea agreement. He was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a lighter sentence. "What kind of deal?" I asked. "Assault in 4th degree instead of 3rd, and simple theft instead of aggravated theft. He'd serve 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of probation with mandatory anger management counseling and a no-contact order." It was everything I had hoped for, but it was justice. It was official recognition that what he'd done to me was criminal, and it would keep him away from me for at least 2 years. "What do you think?" Patricia asked. "I think I want him to admit what he did. I want there to be a record that he assaulted me and stole from me. I don't need him to go to prison for years, but I need him to face consequences. If he takes the plea, he'll have to aliquot. That means he'll have to stand up in court and describe exactly what he did to you. It becomes part of his permanent record." That decided it for me. The idea of Marcus having to stand in front of a judge and admit that he'd broken my ankle, that he had stolen money from me, that he had committed crimes against his own stepdaughter. That felt like justice. I told Patricia to accept the plea if Marcus was willing to aliquot fully and if the no-contact order would be strictly enforced. A week later, we were back in court for the plea hearing. This time, the courtroom was fuller. Marcus's employer had sent someone to observe, and there were a few other people I didn't recognize who were probably connected to his case somehow. When the judge asked Marcus how he pleaded, his voice was barely audible. "Guilty, Your Honor." Then came the allocution. The judge asked Marcus to describe what he had done, and for the first time since the incident, he had to tell the truth. "I pushed Riley Carson during an argument," he said, staring at his feet. "She fell and broke her ankle. I also used her debit card without permission on multiple occasions to make purchases for myself. And you understand that these actions constitute assault and theft." "Yes, Your Honor." It wasn't the full apology I might have wanted, but it was an official admission of guilt. It was Marcus finally acknowledging, on the record, that what he'd done to me was criminal. The judge accepted the plea and imposed the agreed-upon sentence. 6 months in county jail, 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and a no-contact order that would remain in effect for the duration of his probation.
"Mr. Davidson," the judge said, addressing Marcus directly, "I want to be very clear about the terms of your probation. You are not to contact Miss Carson directly or indirectly. You are not to go to her place of work, her school, or any location where you know she is likely to be. If you violate this order, you will serve the remainder of your sentence in state prison. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." That was it. Marcus was taken into custody immediately to begin serving his jail sentence. My mother wasn't in the courtroom. I wasn't sure if she'd known about the hearing or if she'd chosen not to come. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Reeves congratulated me on seeing the case through to the end. "A lot of domestic violence victims aren't able to follow through with prosecutions," she said. "It takes courage to stand up to someone who's hurt you, especially when it's a family member." "It took me a long time to understand that family members aren't supposed to hurt you," I said, "and even longer to understand that when they do, they should face the same consequences as anyone else." As Linda and I drove home, I thought about how much had changed in the 2 months since Marcus had broken my ankle. I'd gone from being someone who accepted abuse as normal family dysfunction to someone who'd successfully prosecuted her abuser. I'd learned the difference between keeping the peace and keeping safe. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever known. But most importantly, I'd learned that justice was possible, even in families,
even when other family members tried to protect the abuser, even when it meant standing alone against people who were supposed to love you. Marcus would serve his time, and I would rebuild my life. The ankle would heal, the financial damage could be repaired, and the emotional scars would fade. But the lesson would stay with me forever. No one has the right to hurt you, no matter how much you love them or how much they claim to love you. And if they do hurt you, they deserve to face consequences. Real consequences. Not family meetings or promises to do better, but the kind of accountability that comes from a system that doesn't care about your personal relationships when deciding whether crimes have been committed. That night, I called Dr. Hendricks to thank her for filing the report that had started everything. She was pleased to hear how the case had turned out, but not surprised. "I see a lot of young women in situations like yours," she said. "The ones who fight back, who refuse to accept abuse as normal, they are the ones who break the cycle. You should be proud of yourself for choosing justice over family loyalty." "I chose real family loyalty," I corrected. "I chose the kind of loyalty that protects people from harm instead of protecting abusers from consequences." She laughed. "That's exactly right. And that's exactly why you won." The first week after Marcus was sentenced felt surreal. I kept expecting some crisis to emerge, some emergency that would require me to drop everything and rush back home to help my mother navigate the aftermath. But the phone stayed quiet, and slowly I began to understand that I was truly free from the exhausting cycle of managing other people's emotions and crises. Linda noticed the change before I did. "You're sleeping better," she observed one morning over coffee, "and you're not checking your phone every 5 minutes anymore." She was right. For years, I'd been unconsciously braced for the next explosion, the next incident that would require careful management and damage control. Living in a house with Marcus meant being constantly alert to shifts in mood, ready to adjust my behavior to avoid setting him off. Now, for the first time in years, I could relax completely. My ankle was healing well, according to Dr. Rodriguez, the orthopedist who'd taken over my care after the surgery. The fractures were knitting together properly, and I was making good progress in physical therapy. More importantly, she said, the psychological trauma wasn't interfering with my physical recovery the way it sometimes did in domestic violence cases. "Victims who feel empowered tend to heal faster," she explained during one of my follow-up appointments. "When you know you've taken control of the situation, your body seems to respond better to treatment." It was true. Despite the pain and the inconvenience of crutches and physical therapy, I felt stronger than I had in years. Every day that passed without having to worry about Marcus's moods felt like a gift. But the real test came when I had to start making decisions about my future. I'd been living day to day since leaving home, focused on the immediate crisis of getting safe and seeing the legal case through to the end. Now I had to figure out what my life was going to look like long term. The first decision was about school. I had messed the start of my senior year because of everything that had happened. But my academic advisor at the university, Dr. Sarah Chen, had been incredibly supportive when I'd explained the situation. She'd helped me apply for emergency financial aid and arranged for me to take a medical leave of absence without penalty. "Domestic violence is recognized as a legitimate reason for academic disruption," she had explained. "The university has resources specifically for students in your situation." I hadn't known such resources existed. There was emergency housing assistance for students fleeing dangerous home situations, counseling services specialized in trauma recovery, even a legal clinic that helps students navigate family court issues. I qualified for additional financial aid as an independent student, since I was no longer receiving any family support. The emergency aid wasn't generous, but it was enough to live on while I focused on finishing my degree. I decided to return to school for the spring semester, which would give me time to fully recover from my ankle injury and complete the legal proceedings against Marcus. In the meantime, I could take online courses to stay on track academically. The second decision was harder: where to live permanently. Linda had made it clear that I was welcome to stay with her as long as I needed, but I knew that wasn't a long-term solution. She had her own life, and I needed to learn how to be independent without relying on anyone else's protection. After much consideration, I decided to look for a small apartment near campus. The university housing office helped me find a one-bedroom that was affordable with my financial aid package, and Linda offered to co-sign the lease until I established my own credit history. "I want you to know," she said as we toured the apartment, "that what you're doing takes real courage. Most people in your situation would be tempted to go back to what's familiar, even if it's dangerous. Building a completely new life from scratch is terrifying." It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based solely on what was best for me, without having to consider how those decisions would affect Marcus's mood or my mother's anxiety. The apartment was small but bright, with large windows that faced east so I'd have morning sunlight. There was a security system and a doorman, which made me feel safe. Most importantly, it was mine. No one else had a key, no one else could decide to change the locks, no one else could invite people I didn't want there. Moving in was an emotional experience. I didn't have much furniture, mostly just what Linda had helped me pick up from thrift stores and what friends had donated. But arranging my few belongings in the space, hanging my diploma on the wall, setting up my small desk by the window, felt like claiming my life back. The night I spent alone in my new apartment for the first time, I called Dr. Hendricks to update her on how everything had turned out. She was proud of me, not just for following through with the legal case, but for rebuilding your life on your own terms. A lot of people wouldn't have been able to do what you've done.
I had help, I said. Good people who believed me and supported me. Yes, but you had to be willing to accept that help, and you had to be willing to fight for yourself. That's not something anyone else could do for you. As the weeks passed, I settled into a routine that felt completely foreign and completely wonderful. I woke up when my body was ready to wake up, not when someone else's schedule demanded it. I ate what I wanted to eat, not what would avoid causing an argument. I came and went from my apartment without having to explain myself to anyone or worry about walking into a tense situation. This silence was the most remarkable thing. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of underlying tension. For the first time in years, I could concentrate completely on my schoolwork, could read for pleasure, could have phone conversations without monitoring someone else's mood in the background. I started therapy with Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in domestic violence recovery. Linda had recommended her, and she'd been incredibly helpful in helping me process everything that had happened. One of the most difficult things for survivors to understand, Dr. Foster explained during one of our sessions, is that the hypervigilance and people-pleasing behaviors that kept you safe in an abusive situation can actually interfere with building healthy relationships afterward. She was right. I found myself apologizing constantly for things that didn't require apologies, automatically deferring to other people's preferences even when it wasn't necessary, scanning for signs of anger or disapproval even in casual interactions with classmates and neighbors. Those responses made sense when you were living with someone who might hurt you for saying the wrong thing, Dr. Foster said. But now you need to learn how to exist in the world as someone who has the right to take up space, to have opinions, to set boundaries. Learning to set boundaries was particularly challenging. I'd spent so many years prioritizing other people's comfort over my own safety that I'd lost track of where my responsibilities ended and other people's began. Dr. Foster helped me practice saying no to requests that felt unreasonable, expressing preferences even when they differed from other people's, and recognizing when someone was trying to manipulate me into compliance. The work was exhausting, but necessary. I was essentially reprogramming responses that had been ingrained for years, learning to trust my own judgment instead of constantly seeking external validation. The progress was gradual but noticeable. I stopped apologizing for taking up space in elevators. I started expressing preferences about where to eat when friends asked me out for dinner. I learned to recognize the difference between someone being disappointed by my decision and someone being angry at me for not complying with their wishes. Most importantly, I learned to recognize red flags in potential relationships. Dr. Foster helped me understand that people who respected boundaries wouldn't be offended by me setting them, and people who were offended by reasonable boundaries probably weren't safe people to be around. The lessons became practical when I started dating again. I had been so focused on survival and recovery that romance had been the last thing on my mind. But as I got healthier and more confident, I began to feel ready for companionship again. The first few dates were disasters, mostly because I was so focused on avoiding men who reminded me of Marcus that I couldn't relax enough to get to know anyone. But gradually, I learned to distinguish between legitimate caution and trauma responses that were interfering with my ability to connect with people.
I met David in my advanced psychology class. He was older than most students, having returned to school after serving in the military, and he had a calm, steady presence that I found appealing. When he asked me out for coffee, I almost said no automatically, but something made me reconsider. Our first conversation lasted for hours. He told me about his experience overseas, his decision to use the GI Bill to study psychology, his hope of working with veterans dealing with PTSD. I found myself talking about my own interest in trauma recovery, though I didn't share the personal details that had led to that interest. What struck me most about David was how he listened. He didn't try to fix my problems or offer unsolicited advice. He didn't get defensive when I disagreed with something he said. He didn't seem to need me to be anything other than exactly who I was. After several weeks of casual dating, I decided to tell him about what had happened with Marcus. I was nervous about how he'd react, worried that he'd see me as damaged or complicated or too much trouble. Instead, his reaction was exactly what I should have expected from someone healthy. He was horrified by what Marcus had done, proud of me for fighting back, and supportive of my ongoing recovery. He didn't try to minimize what had happened or rush me toward moving on. He just listened and offered comfort when I needed it. The fact that you survived that and still trusted me enough to tell me about it says everything I need to know about how strong you are. It was the kind of response that would have seemed impossible coming from anyone in my family. David understood instinctively that my history of abuse wasn't something to be ashamed of or gotten over quickly. It was part of my story, part of what had shaped me, but it didn't define my worth or my capacity for healthy relationships. Dating David taught me what normal looked like in a romantic relationship. Arguments that stayed focused on the actual issue without escalating into personal attacks, disagreements that got resolved through conversation rather than one person dominating the other, physical affection that was always consensual and never used as a tool of intimidation. Most importantly, I learned what it felt like to be with someone who genuinely wanted me to be happy and successful, even when my happiness didn't serve his immediate interests. When I got accepted into a graduate program in social work, David's first reaction was excitement for me, not concern about how it would affect our relationship. It was a stark contrast to the dynamic I'd grown up with, where my achievements were seen as potential threats to family stability, and my independence was discouraged as selfish. The graduate program acceptance was the culmination of a year of hard work rebuilding my academic life. I'd finished my undergraduate degree with honors, despite the disruption of my senior year, and I had decided that I wanted to spend my career helping other people in situations similar to what I'd experienced. Dr. Foster had encouraged me to consider social work, suggesting that my personal experience with trauma and recovery could be valuable in helping others heal. But she'd also warned me about the importance of being fully healed before trying to help other people heal. She'd said, "You can't pour from an empty cup, and you can't guide someone through a process you haven't completed yourself." I took that advice seriously, working hard in therapy to address my own trauma before applying to graduate school. By the time I started the program, I felt confident that I could learn about domestic violence and trauma from an academic perspective without being re-traumatized by the material. The coursework was challenging, but fascinating. I learned about the psychology of abuse, the societal factors that enabled domestic violence, the legal and social service systems that were supposed to protect victims. I studied case management, crisis intervention, family systems therapy, and trauma-informed care. But perhaps most valuably, I learned that what had happened to me was part of a much larger pattern. Domestic violence affected millions of people across all demographics, and the responses I'd received from my family were depressingly common. Mothers who chose abusive partners over protective parenting, family members who prioritized keeping the peace over keeping people safe, communities that treated domestic violence as private family business rather than criminal behavior. Understanding the broader context helped me make sense of my own experience without personalizing my mother's choices. She hadn't failed to protect me because there was something wrong with me specifically. She had failed to protect me because she had internalized cultural messages about women's roles, family loyalty, and the importance of maintaining relationships at any cost. That understanding didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me forgive it. Forgiveness, I learned, wasn't about absolving people of responsibility for the harm they had caused. It was about releasing the anger that was taking up space in my own heart and mind. The process of forgiving my mother took most of my first year in graduate school. Dr. Foster helped me work through the layers of hurt and betrayal, the grief over losing the mother I'd needed, and the anger over being forced to protect myself when protection should have been freely given. Eventually, I reached a place where I could feel compassion for my mother without feeling responsible for her choices. When I was ready, I reached out to her. It had been almost 2 years since we'd spoken. I'd heard through Linda that she and Marcus had divorced while he was in jail, that she'd moved to a smaller apartment across town, that she was working as a receptionist at a medical office.
Linda had also mentioned that she'd asked about me several times, wanting to know how I was doing, but respecting my need for space. I called her on a Saturday morning in the spring of my second year in graduate school. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been hoping for exactly this call. "Riley?" Her voice was tentative, hopeful, afraid. "Hi, Mom." We talked for over an hour that first time. She told me about her life after leaving Marcus, about how difficult it had been to start over at 50, but also how relieved she felt to be free of the constant tension and unpredictability. She'd started therapy herself, she said, and was beginning to understand how much damage she'd done by staying with Marcus as long as she had. "I know I failed you," she said, and her voice was thick with tears. "I know I chose him over you, and I know that was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I understand what I did." It wasn't the conversation I'd imagined we'd have, but it was honest, in a way our family had never been before. She didn't try to justify her choices or minimize the harm they'd caused. She just acknowledged what had happened and took responsibility for her part in it. "I'm proud of you for getting out," she continued. "I'm proud of you for fighting back, for building a life for yourself, for not letting what happened to you define your future. You're stronger than I ever was." I cried during that conversation, not from sadness, but from relief. For years, I'd carried the weight of wondering whether I was crazy, whether I was overreacting, whether the problems in our family were somehow my fault. Hearing my mother acknowledge that she'd failed to protect me lifted a burden I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. We started talking regularly after that, rebuilding our relationship slowly and carefully. It wasn't the mother-daughter relationship I'd originally wanted, but it was honest and healthy in ways our family had never been before. She came to my graduation from the social work program, sitting proudly in the audience as I walked across the stage to receive my master's degree. David was there too, along with Linda and Dr. Foster and several friends I'd made in the program. Looking out at that small group of people who'd supported me through the hardest period of my life, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. I'd lost the family I'd grown up with, but I'd gained something much more valuable, a chosen family of people who loved me without conditions, who supported my growth without trying to control it, who celebrated my successes without feeling threatened by them. After graduation, I was offered a position at the same domestic violence shelter where I'd done my fieldwork placement. The director, Maria Santos, had been impressed with my work with clients and my understanding of trauma dynamics. "Survivors who go into this work bring a perspective that can't be taught," she told me. "You understand what it feels like from the inside, and that helps you connect with clients in ways that other advocates sometimes can't." The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. I helped women develop safety plans, navigate the legal system, access resources for housing and financial assistance. I facilitated support groups for survivors at various stages of recovery. I worked with children who had witnessed domestic violence, helping them process their experiences and develop healthy coping strategies. Most importantly, I was able to offer something I desperately needed during my own crisis: validation, that what they'd experienced was real, that it wasn't their fault, and that there were people who would believe them and support them in fighting back. One of my first clients was a young woman named Jessica, whose story had eerie similarities to my own. She'd been financially abused by her boyfriend, who'd convinced her that contributing her entire paycheck to their shared expenses was normal, while he spent his money on whatever he wanted.
When she'd finally questioned the arrangement, he'd responded by pushing her down a flight of stairs, resulting in a broken wrist and several bruised ribs. Jessica's family was pressuring her to drop the charges, insisting that it had been an accident and that she was destroying a good relationship over a misunderstanding. She came to me confused and doubting her own perceptions, wondering if maybe everyone else was right and she was overreacting. "Tell me about the financial arrangement," I said during our first session. "Walk me through exactly how money worked in your relationship." As she described the systematic way her boyfriend had taken control of her finances, isolated her from friends who might have questioned the situation, and used her economic dependence to prevent her from leaving, I could see her beginning to understand that what had happened to her was deliberate and calculated. "That's not love," I told her. "Love doesn't require you to give up your financial independence. Love doesn't respond to reasonable questions with violence." Working with Jessica reminded me of my own journey, from confusion to clarity, from self-blame to understanding that the problem wasn't with me. Helping her navigate the legal system, supporting her through the trial where her boyfriend was ultimately convicted, watching her rebuild her life with healthy boundaries and self-respect felt like completing a circle. I'd gone from victim to survivor to advocate, using my own healing to help other people find their way to safety and freedom. The work also helped me understand something important about my relationship with my mother. Forgiveness hadn't meant returning to the old dynamic where I was responsible for managing her emotions and protecting her from consequences. It had meant establishing a new relationship based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. When she occasionally slipped back into old patterns, asking me to keep information from Linda or trying to get me to mediate conflicts with other family members, I was able to respond with compassion but firmly. "I'm not willing to keep secrets or manage other people's relationships," I would tell her. "I care about you, but I'm not responsible for fixing your problems." At first, she struggled with those boundaries, interpreting them as rejection or punishment. But over time, she began to understand that they were actually the foundation of a healthier relationship. When I didn't have to worry about being manipulated or guilted into compliance, I could be more present and genuine in our interactions. By my third year in my social work career, I'd been promoted to a supervisory position and was training new advocates. I'd also started speaking at conferences about the intersection of domestic violence and family systems, sharing insights from both my professional and personal experience. The speaking engagements were nerve-wracking at first, but I found that audiences were hungry for authentic perspectives on domestic violence recovery. Too much of the professional discourse was clinical and detached, failing to capture the emotional reality of what it felt like to be trapped in an abusive situation and what it took to break free. "The hardest part isn't usually leaving," I would tell audiences. "It's learning to trust your own judgment again after years of being told that your perceptions are wrong. It's learning to believe that you deserve safety and respect, even when the people who are supposed to love you most have convinced you otherwise." One of my presentations was attended by Dr. Hendricks, the orthopedic surgeon who had first validated my experience and filed the report that started my journey towards justice. She approached me afterward with tears in her eyes. "I filed hundreds of these reports over the years," she said. "Most of the time, I never find out what happens afterward. Thank you for showing me that sometimes it does make a difference." I realized that she was right. My story wasn't just about my own healing and success. It was about the importance of people in positions of authority speaking up when they witness abuse, even when it was inconvenient or complicated. Dr. Hendricks had seen something that didn't look right and had acted on her professional and moral obligation to report it. That single decision had set in motion a chain of events that had not only saved me from continued abuse, but had also resulted in accountability for Marcus and education for my mother about the true nature of their relationship. How many other people might have intervened over the years if they'd understood the importance of speaking up? How many victims might have been saved if more professionals had been willing to ask direct questions and file reports when they suspected abuse? I started incorporating that message into my speaking engagements, emphasizing that domestic violence intervention was everyone's responsibility, not just the responsibility of victims to report or leave. "Abusers count on silence," I would tell audiences of healthcare workers, teachers, social workers, and community members. They count on people looking the other way, making excuses, believing that family business should stay private. But abuse thrives in secrecy and dies in the light of accountability. The message seemed to resonate. After my presentations, I would often have audience members approach me with their own stories of times they'd suspected abuse but hadn't known how to respond. Some shared regrets about not speaking up when they'd had the chance. Others talked about feeling inspired to be more proactive in recognizing and reporting signs of domestic violence. One conversation that particularly moved me was with a young doctor who told me she'd seen several patients with injuries that didn't match their explanations, but had never felt confident enough to pursue it further. "I always worried I was overstepping," she said, "but after hearing your story, I realized that not asking the hard questions is actually the bigger risk." She contacted me several months later to tell me that she'd filed her first domestic violence report after recognizing the signs in a patient's case. The report had led to an investigation that ultimately helped the victim escape a dangerous situation and resulted in criminal charges against the abuser. "I kept thinking about what you said about Dr. Hendricks," she told me, "about how one person's willingness to speak up changed everything for you."
I wanted to be that person for someone else. Stories like that reminded me why the work was so important. Every person who found the courage to leave an abusive situation, every professional who learned to recognize the signs and speak up, every family member who chose to believe and support a victim instead of protecting an abuser was part of a larger cultural shift away from tolerating domestic violence. My personal life had stabilized and flourished alongside my professional growth. David and I had moved in together after 2 years of dating, and our relationship continued to be a model of what healthy partnership looked like. We supported each other's career goals without competition or resentment. We had disagreements without fear that they would escalate into something dangerous. We made decisions together based on mutual respect and consideration. When he proposed 3 years after we'd met, it was in the context of a conversation about our shared vision for the future, rather than a grand romantic gesture designed to sweep me off my feet. We both wanted partnership based on genuine compatibility and shared values, not the kind of intense emotional dependency that often masqueraded as love. Planning our wedding gave me an opportunity to practice the boundaries I'd learned in therapy. We kept the guest list small, including only people who had been genuinely supportive of our relationship. My mother was invited, but Marcus was not, despite their divorce. Some extended family members who had pressured me to reconcile with Marcus were not included. "Your wedding should be a celebration of your new life," Dr. Foster had told me when I'd expressed guilt about not inviting certain family members. "You don't owe anyone a place at your table just because you're related to them." The wedding itself was everything I'd hoped for: intimate, meaningful, and completely free of drama. My mother behaved beautifully, focusing on celebrating my happiness rather than creating any tension. Linda gave a toast about the strength and resilience I'd shown in rebuilding my life. David's family welcomed me warmly, treating me like the daughter they'd gained rather than an outsider they had to accommodate. Most movingly, several of my former clients attended, women whose lives had been touched by my advocacy work and who wanted to celebrate my personal happiness. Seeing them there, healthy and strong, and surrounded by people who loved and supported them, felt like validation of everything I'd worked for. As I looked around the room at our small gathering of chosen family and close friends, I thought about how different my life had become from what I'd once imagined. I'd lost the family I'd grown up with, but I'd gained something much more valuable: a life built on authenticity, self-respect, and genuine love. The first few years of marriage were an adjustment, not because there were problems, but because I had to learn to trust that good things could last. I kept waiting for some crisis to emerge, some sign that the stability and happiness I'd found were temporary. But as time passed and our life together remained consistently peaceful and supportive, I began to relax into the security of knowing I was truly safe. David never raised his voice in anger, never tried to control my behavior or limit my independence, never made me feel like I had to choose between his happiness and my own well-being. We bought a house together, a modest but comfortable place with a large garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers. Having a space that was truly ours, where we could make decisions about paint colors and furniture placement without consulting anyone else or worrying about someone else's reaction, felt like the ultimate expression of the freedom I'd fought so hard to achieve. The house became a gathering place for our chosen family. Linda visited regularly, often bringing homemade meals and updates on extended family drama that no longer had the power to stress me out. My mother came for holidays, our relationship having evolved into something genuine and reciprocal rather than the one-sided caretaking it had been before. David's military friends became part of our circle, along with colleagues from my work and friends we'd made in our neighborhood. We hosted dinner parties and game nights, creating the kind of warm, welcoming home environment I'd always wanted but had never known how to achieve. Most importantly, our home was a place of complete safety. No one had to monitor their words or walk on eggshells. Disagreements were handled with respect and consideration. Everyone who entered our space understood that it was a place where people were valued and protected. When we decided to start a family, I had to work through my fears about becoming a mother myself. Dr. Foster helped me process my concerns about repeating patterns from my own childhood, about whether I would be able to protect my children in ways my mother hadn't protected me. "You've already broken the cycle," she reminded me. "You've done the work to heal from your own trauma, you've learned to set boundaries and recognize unhealthy behavior, and you've chosen a partner who shares your commitment to creating a safe family environment." She was right. By the time our daughter Emma was born, I felt confident in my ability to parent from a place of strength and security rather than fear and dysfunction. David was a natural father, patient and engaged and completely supportive of my parenting decisions. Watching him interact with Emma, seeing the gentleness and respect he showed even when she was fussy or demanding, drove home how abnormal Marcus's behavior had truly been. Normal men didn't lose their temper with children. Normal men didn't use physical intimidation to control family members. Normal men didn't see family relationships as power struggles to be won. Emma grew up in an environment where her safety and well-being were the top priorities, where the adults in her life worked together to meet her needs rather than expecting her to manage their emotions. She learned to express her feelings without fear of retaliation, to set boundaries without guilt, to trust that the people who loved her would protect her rather than hurt her. As she got older and began to understand that not all families were like ours, I told her age-appropriate versions of my own story. I wanted her to understand that people sometimes made choices that hurt the ones they were supposed to love, but that those choices were never the fault of the person being hurt. Some grown-ups don't know how to handle their feelings in healthy ways, I explained when she was old enough to understand. When that happens, it's the grown-up's job to get help and learn better ways. It's never a child's job to fix a grown-up's problems. These conversations helped me process my own childhood in new ways. Explaining healthy family dynamics to Emma clarified for me just how distorted my own upbringing had been, but also how much I'd learned and grown since then. When Emma started school, I became involved in parent-teacher organizations and community groups focused on child safety and family wellness. The work felt like a natural extension of my professional advocacy, applying the same principles on a broader scale. I helped develop educational programs for parents about recognizing signs of domestic violence in other families, creating safe spaces for children to report concerns, and building community networks that supported healthy family functioning. The programs were well received, partly because I could speak from both professional expertise and lived experience. Parents trusted my advice because they knew I understood what it was like to grow up in an unsafe home and was committed to preventing other children from experiencing the same thing. One evening, after a particularly successful workshop on teaching children about healthy relationships, I came home to find David and Emma playing in the garden. They were laughing together as they harvested tomatoes for dinner, completely absorbed in their task and in each other's company. Watching them, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with my professional achievements. I had broken the cycle of dysfunction that had characterized my family for generations. I had created a home where children could grow up feeling safe and valued. I had learned to love and be loved in ways that enhanced rather than diminished everyone involved. The journey from the terrified young woman lying on the kitchen floor with a broken ankle to the confident mother and advocate I'd become had been long and sometimes difficult, but every step had been worth it, every challenge had made me stronger, every lesson had brought me closer to the life I was meant to live. My relationship with my mother continued to evolve as well. She became a devoted grandmother to Emma, but always within the boundaries I set about appropriate behavior and communication.
She'd learned to ask permission before giving advice, to respect my decisions even when she disagreed with them, to celebrate her successes without trying to take credit for them. The transformation hadn't been easy for her. In therapy, she'd had to confront not only her failure to protect me from Marcus, but also the patterns of codependency and people-pleasing that had made her vulnerable to his manipulation in the first place. But she'd done the work, and our relationship was now based on mutual respect rather than guilt and obligation. When she visited, she contributed to our household rather than expecting to be catered to. When she disagreed with my parenting choices, she kept her opinions to herself unless I specifically asked for advice. Most importantly, she'd learned to see me as a separate person with my own needs and rights, rather than as an extension of herself, whose primary purpose was to make her life easier. The healing in our relationship allowed Emma to have a grandmother who was genuinely loving and supportive, rather than manipulative and demanding. It also gave me a sense of closure about my childhood that I hadn't expected to achieve. Marcus, meanwhile, had disappeared from our lives completely after serving his jail sentence. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to another state and was working in construction again, but he'd never attempted to contact me or anyone in my family. The no-contact order had expired years earlier, but he seemed to understand that any attempt to re-establish contact would be unwelcome and potentially illegal. His absence was a relief, confirming that the legal consequences he'd faced had been effective in protecting me from further harm. Sometimes I wondered whether he'd learned anything from the experience, whether he'd gotten help for his anger issues or simply found new victims to target. But I'd learned not to spend emotional energy on questions I couldn't answer. My focus remained on my own continued growth and on helping other people escape similar situations. As Emma grew older and more curious about family history, I shared more details about my experience with Marcus and the legal case that had changed my life. I wanted her to understand that standing up to abuse was always.
It was only because I'd been conditioned to prioritize family loyalty over personal safety that it had seemed like such a difficult decision at the time. Emma's reaction also confirmed that I'd succeeded in raising a child who understood her own worth and rights. If she ever faced a similar situation, she would know instinctively that protecting herself was not only acceptable but necessary. On the 10th anniversary of the day Marcus broke my ankle, I took a day off work to reflect on how much my life had changed. David took Emma to school and gave me space to process privately, understanding that anniversaries of traumatic events could be emotionally challenging, even when the outcome had been positive. I spent the morning walking through our neighborhood, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had lain on that kitchen floor a decade earlier could never have imagined the life I was living now. She'd been so focused on survival, on managing other people's emotions, on making herself small enough to avoid conflict. The woman I'd become was confident, successful, surrounded by people who loved and respected her. I had meaningful work that helped other people, a marriage based on genuine partnership, a daughter who was growing up strong and secure. I had learned to trust my own judgment, to set boundaries without guilt, to prioritize my own well-being without apology. Most importantly, I had learned the difference between real love and manipulation disguised as love. Real love didn't require sacrifice of safety or self-respect. Real love didn't demand silence in the face of harm. Real love created space for growth and independence rather than demanding compliance and control. That afternoon, I visited Dr. Hendricks in her office. She was nearing retirement but still practicing, still filing reports when she suspected domestic violence, still speaking up for patients who couldn't speak up for themselves. "I've often thought about your case over the years," she told me as we caught up. "It's one of the ones that reminds me why this work matters. One conversation, one report, one person willing to speak the truth can change everything." She was right, of course. Her willingness to ask direct questions and document what she saw had set in motion a chain of events that had saved my life and transformed my future. But it had also done something else. It had shown me that there were people in the world who would believe victims, who would take action to protect vulnerable people, who understood that professional obligations sometimes meant getting involved in situations that were uncomfortable or complicated. That lesson had shaped not only my recovery, but also my career.
Every client I helped, every presentation I gave, every policy I helped develop was an extension of the advocacy Dr. Hendricks had shown me that day in the hospital. As I drove home that evening, I thought about all the people who had played crucial roles in my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Dr. Hendricks, who had spoken up when she could have stayed silent. Janet Williams, who had taken my reports seriously and connected me with resources. Patricia Reeves, who had prosecuted Marcus with competence and compassion. Linda, who had provided shelter and support without judgment. Dr. Foster, who had helped me heal from trauma and learn to build healthy relationships. Each of them had chosen to use their position, their knowledge, their authority to help someone who was struggling. Each of them had understood that their intervention could make a difference in someone's life. But I also thought about the people who had made different choices. My mother, who had prioritized her own security over my safety until it was almost too late. The family members who had pressured me to drop charges to avoid family drama. The acquaintances who had suggested that I should just move on rather than pursuing justice. The contrast had taught me something important about the choices we all face when confronted with injustice. We can speak up or stay silent. We can believe victims or protect abusers. We can use our influence to help or to harm. Every day, in small ways and large ones, we get to decide what kind of person we want to be. I'd chosen to be someone who spoke up, who believed victims, who used whatever influence I had to help rather than harm. It hadn't always been easy, but it had been worth it. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed, she asked me about the photo on my nightstand. It was a picture from my college graduation, taken just months after the trial had ended. I was wearing my cap and gown, holding my diploma, surrounded by Linda and Dr. Foster and a few close friends. "You look different in this picture," Emma observed. "Stronger." She was right. The woman in that photo had been through hell, but had come out the other side transformed. She'd learned to value herself, to fight for herself, to build a life based on her own choices rather than other people's expectations. I was different, I told Emma. I'd learned some important things about myself and about what I deserved from life. What kinds of things? That I was worth protecting, that I had the right to be safe and respected, that love should never hurt. Emma nodded solemnly, filing away another piece of wisdom for her own future use. I kissed her goodnight and turned off the light, grateful once again for the opportunity to raise a child who would never have to learn those lessons the hard way. As I prepared for bed myself, I reflected on the unexpected gifts that had come from the worst experience of my life. The trauma had been real and lasting, but so had the growth that had followed. I'd discovered reserves of strength I'd never known I possessed. I'd learned to build relationships based on authenticity rather than performance. I'd found my calling in helping other people navigate similar challenges. Most importantly, I'd learned that we don't have to be defined by what happens to us. We can choose how to respond, how to grow, how to use our experiences to create meaning and purpose in our lives. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had taken years, but every step had been worth it. I'd not only escaped the cycle of abuse that had trapped me, but had helped others do the same. I'd not only healed from my own trauma, but had learned to use that healing to benefit other people. As I drifted off to sleep that night, surrounded by the safety and love I'd worked so hard to create, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life I'd built. It wasn't the life I'd originally planned, but it was better than anything I could have imagined when I was lying on that kitchen floor with a broken ankle and a broken spirit. I'd learned that sometimes the best things in life come not from avoiding hardship, but facing it with courage and determination. I'd learned that we can be both vulnerable and strong, both wounded and healed, both marked by trauma and defined by resilience. Most of all, I'd learned that love, real love, creates safety rather than destroying it, builds people up rather than tearing them down, and provides support for growth rather than demanding compliance and silence. It had taken me 22 years to learn those lessons, but they've shaped every day of my life since then. And now I got to spend my days teaching them to other people, helping them discover their own worth and strength, showing them that escape was possible and that healing was real. The work continued, the healing continued, the growth continued. And every day, I got to wake up in a life I'd created through my own choices, surrounded by people who loved me for exactly who I was. It had been worth every difficult step of the journey. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.